I remember how carefully I folded the napkins that morning. My hands were slower now, a little stiff, but still precise. Blue linen ones pressed and creased at the edges, placed in little spirals beside each plate. The kind of quiet touch that says, "You are welcome here." I had done it for years, birthdays, holidays, every gathering since I became the matriarch of a house full of people who forgot I used to be the girl serving everyone sweet tea in mason jars. They forgot, but I remembered. The table was set with the good china, not the newer white minimalist ones my daughter kept pushing on me, but the old ones rimmed in faded violets and stories. Every plate chipped in the exact place that made them familiar. I remember placing them one by one on the table, adjusting the cutlery, thinking to myself how nice it would be to hear laughter again. My laughter, not the polished, filtered kind they serve with sparkling water, and forced politeness, but the real kind, like the sound I made the first time my granddaughter told me a secret, or when my neighbor's dog tripped over its own leash and looked embarrassed about it. That kind of laughter, human, soft, unedited. I'd invited a few people this time, just a small gathering, nothing fancy despite what they might assume. There was the nurse who used to visit me when I came home from the hospital, sweet, dependable, always remembered how I liked my tea. A woman who had shown up for me in ways my own blood sometimes didn't. A couple of neighbors, a few old friends. Some had silver in their hair like me, others still dyed it the way we used to, in the 70s. But they all had warmth, and that was enough. I just wanted warmth. My daughter didn't ask who was coming. She assumed she would approve. That's what hurt most. Not the arrogance, but the assumption that after all this time, after all the Sunday roast, school pickup, sleepless nights by fevered beds, she could just waltz in and curate my life like an Instagram page. My life didn't need aesthetic approval. It needed truth. She arrived early, of course, with her husband who always looked at my house like it was one big missed opportunity for an open concept layout, and their daughter who spent more time looking into mirrors than people's eyes. My granddaughter smiled at me, as if she were seeing a statue in a museum. Polite, removed, admiring something she had already decided she'd never want to be. They brought a cake, one of those expensive ones from the bakery with sharp corners and too much fondant. It was beautiful and tasteless, like so many things these days. Everything looks so quaint, my daughter said, as she walked in, glancing over the table. I smiled. I call it lived in. She rolled her eyes. I pretended not to see. The nurse arrived last. She was wearing a yellow blouse with a sunflower print and handed me a bouquet wrapped in recycled paper. She hugged me like I mattered, like she had wanted to come not because she had to, but because she genuinely cared. I saw the glance my daughter gave her. That one sideways glance women share when they think no one notices. And then I heard it. Not words, not yet, but I heard it in her breath, the way her husband leaned in, the shift in their bodies. Something was wrong. The way people make space around someone they don't consider their kind. It was so fast, so quiet, you'd miss it if you didn't already know the language of exclusion. But I did. I knew it in my bones. Still, I kept folding napkins and placing forks like nothing happened. That's the thing about being older. You learn not to flinch. You learn to keep building the table, even when you know the guests don't deserve the invitation. The brunch itself was pleasant enough on the surface, chatter sips of mimosa compliments that hovered just above sincerity. But under it all was this hum, this buzz, like a wire ready to snap. I could feel it in the way my daughter kept adjusting her seat to avoid facing my friend, in how her husband spoke only to their own table, pretending the others were somehow less real, in how my granddaughter, who used to play in this very room with plastic animals and paper crowns, now stared at her phone instead of listening to the stories I had waited a whole year to tell. And still I smiled, passed the butter, laughed when someone made a joke about cholesterol, not because I was trying to keep the peace, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to try. Because even then, even as the first cracks began to show, I thought maybe we could still stitch the seams. But the thing about cracks is once you hear them form, you can't unhear the silence that follows. And that silence was just beginning. The dishes were still warm when I excused myself to the hallway, not to escape, not yet, but to fetch a stack of extra napkins, something to keep my hands busy, to keep from looking too long into the uncomfortable smiles sitting around that table. As I stepped past the dining room arch, the voices thinned into murmurs. I didn't mean to hear them. Truly I didn't. But the house I'd lived in for 4 decades has its secrets wood that carries sound vents that betray you, walls that barely pretend. I paused at the linen cupboard just down the hall, fingers brushing over the folded cloths like they might offer me some reassurance. That's when I heard it. Not the words at first, just the cadence, the kind of hushed pitch people use when they think they're safe behind a door someone forgot to close. It's just, she doesn't fit our vibe. My daughter's voice, crisp, controlled, as if she were talking about furniture. Then her husband chimed in, "It's your mom's party, but that woman. What was she wearing, yellow with sunflowers? Come on." A soft scoff, then laughter. Not kind laughter. Not the belly-deep, genuine kind that families are supposed to share. This was brittle and sharp, like glass, being swept into a dustpan. I stood there, frozen, napkins in hand, my back to the wall. I could hear my pulse more clearly than I heard their words, but their tone, it carved into me. They were talking about her, my friend. The woman who once bathed me after surgery, who sat with me when the pain in my hip flared, and no one else picked up the phone. She who brought me soup without asking. She who asked me how I really felt, not just whether I'd taken my meds. "She's just so out of place," my daughter continued. "It's like she doesn't get how we do things." The door creaked behind me just slightly. I didn't move. I wanted to, but my feet were filled with cement. There was a familiar echo in their words, something that didn't start today. I'd heard them talk like this before, not always about people, sometimes about places or decor or old recipes that didn't look good on camera. My house, my life, slowly being edited out of relevance. "She smells like eucalyptus or something. It's weird," he said. Another laugh, another nail in the floorboards. It wasn't just the words. It was the cruelty tucked into their normalcy, the way they said it like it was completely reasonable, like kindness was aesthetic and mine had gone out of style. I walked back, slowly, napkins tight in my fist. They didn't notice me. Or maybe they did, and just assumed I couldn't hear through the years of my age. But I had heard. Every syllable. Back at the table, the energy had shifted. The nurse was pouring juice into her glass, smiling at nothing in particular. My daughter caught my eye and smiled too tight-lipped, like a stranger at a check-in counter. I sat down, carefully folded the napkins, and placed one in my lap. My hands trembled slightly, not from age this time, but restraint. The brunch droned on. My daughter told a story about her new Pilates instructor. Her husband bragged about some promotion. They talked around the nurse like she was invisible. And my granddaughter, she didn't say much at all, just nodded, laughed when appropriate, and checked her phone under the table. No one asked how I was feeling. No one noticed the shadows pooling under my friend's eyes when she caught the cold stares tossed her way. but I noticed. I always notice. After the plates were cleared, my nurse stood to leave first. She touched my shoulder gently and said, "Thank you for including me. I had a lovely time." And she meant it. I could tell. I wanted to say something, anything, but the lump in my throat had built too high. I just nodded and squeezed her hand. She didn't ask if she should stay. She could feel it too. The wall that had been built around her in that room. A wall she hadn't built, one they hadn't even bothered to hide. After she left, my daughter spoke casually as she placed a fork in the dishwasher. "Mom, you really need to be more selective. Some people just don't fit." There it was, again. I looked at her, really looked, and I couldn't recognize her face. Not the baby I used to bathe in a plastic tub. Not the girl who used to run to me after nightmares. Just a woman who had traded compassion for status, and worst of all, believed she was right to do so. I said nothing. Not yet. The words were still gathering inside me, weaving into something too heavy for a single reply. I just nodded, went back to the table, and picked up a teacup. Later that night, I stood by the window and stared out at the streetlight flickering just beyond the hedges. I thought of all the gatherings that house had held, anniversaries, broken hearts, homecomings, and now this, a birthday where the gift was clarity, unwanted, but necessary. I heard their whispers, and I heard what they didn't say too. They didn't just mean she didn't fit their vibe. They meant I didn't either. She had always loved that wicker chair. I found it years ago at a flea market, a little worn on the arms, sun-bleached in places, but something about it called to me. I brought it home, repainted it soft cream, and placed it near the bay window, where the afternoon light could spill across the cushions. Over time, that chair became hers more than mine. Whenever she visited, whether it was to check my blood pressure, help me with groceries, or just sit and talk, she'd settle into that spot, like she belonged there. And she did. There was a stillness about her, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. She brought with her a calm I hadn't felt in years, the kind of presence that didn't make demands or keep score. She didn't come to take. She came to be. There's something holy about people like that. I remember one afternoon, maybe a year ago now, when the arthritis was particularly cruel. I'd spilled a jar of pickles trying to get it down from the top shelf. She showed up 15 minutes after I called, not out of obligation, but concern. She cleaned the floor while humming, poured me a glass of water, and then sat in that chair, crossing her legs beneath her like a teenager. We laughed until I cried. Or maybe I cried until we laughed. I can't remember. All I know is that my kitchen hadn't felt like mine in a long time, until she stepped in and made it feel like home again. She wore colors like mustard yellow, forest green, coral. She didn't mute herself for anyone. She smelled like eucalyptus and warm spices, the kind of scent that lingers on fabric long after someone leaves. To me, she was comfort. But to them, my daughter, her husband, the granddaughter who barely made eye contact, she was an eyesore, an interruption in their curated image of how things were supposed to look. She doesn't fit our vibe. That phrase kept echoing in my mind, circling like a vulture. What was their vibe exactly? Cold Gray's overpriced candles, conversations that never broke the surface. I watched them watch her. Not like you watch a person, but like you inspect something to see if it belongs on a shelf. They looked right through her kindness, right past her humanity, and saw only a threat to their aesthetic. I thought of all the people who had ever sat in that chair. Friends, long-gone neighbors who dropped in with casseroles, even my own mother in her final years. That chair had held grief and joy, laughter and mourning, and now somehow it had become controversial. During the brunch, she barely spoke. I noticed that. She, who usually had stories about her garden or the book she was reading, sat quietly picking at her fruit salad eyes, lowered more than usual. She must have felt it too, the invisible fence they'd put up around her, with every glance, every withheld smile. At one point I tried to bring her into the conversation. "Tell them about that time you found the baby bird in your yard," I said. "The one with the crooked beak." She smiled faintly. "Oh, it wasn't much. Just a little thing, but I built a nest from an old colander and kept it warm in the laundry room. It flew off a week later, stronger." No one responded. My granddaughter blinked and looked at her nails. My daughter said, "That's sweet," in a tone that meant the opposite. And her husband didn't even pretend. The silence afterward was thicker than any words could have been. I watched her shrink into herself after that. She excused herself soon after the plates were cleared, touched my shoulder gently, and thanked me with that same kind smile she always wore. But I knew. She had felt it, and I hated that they had taken something from her that day, not just her place at the table, but her sense of safety in my home. After she left, I lingered by the front door, touching the frame where she had rested her hand. The smell of her eucalyptus oil was still faint in the air, and I realized something that made my chest tighten. My home had been hers too in ways no one else had noticed. She had tended to it, not with money or control, but with care. She had helped it breathe. I went back to the wicker chair and sat down slowly. The cushion was still warm. I let my fingers trace the weave of the armrest. How many conversations had this chair overheard? How many moments of quiet mercy had it held? It wasn't about the chair, or even the nurse. It was about the way they looked at the things I loved and judged them unworthy, not because they weren't good, but because they weren't theirs. That's what stung. They didn't need my house to be theirs. They needed my life to be theirs, something they could edit, polish, filter. But some things aren't meant to be curated. Some things are meant to be felt. And suddenly the idea of change no longer scared me. What scared me more was this creeping erosion of soul, the way everything tender was being repackaged into something sterile and safe. That wicker chair would never fit their vibe, neither would I. After the nurse left, the house felt quieter, but not in the peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet that clings to the walls, like fog over cold water. My granddaughter was the first to break it. She leaned toward me across the table with that gentle tone she uses when she wants something, and said, "Grandma, you know people don't mean anything by it. They just want what's best." It was the kind of sentence designed to sound loving, but carried all the weight of dismissal, as if what had happened wasn't really what happened, as if it was just a matter of perception, my perception. And my perception apparently was too outdated to be trusted. She smiled then, not cruelly, not even knowingly, but it was the kind of smile that didn't belong in that moment. It was polished, bright, and hollow, like the ones they use in advertisements when pretending to be moved by a coffee mug or a phone case. I looked at her, really looked. Her face, once so expressive as a child, now held a practiced calm. Not peace, no. Control. The kind of calm you wear like a mask to stay acceptable, to stay inside the lines. I remembered when she was small, when she'd run through my garden barefoot, trailing giggles and the scent of sunshine. She used to bury little treasures under the rose bushes and whisper to the dirt as if it could keep her secrets. That child used to look at me like I hung the moon, and now here she was patting my hand and trying to smooth over a wound with words made of gauze and air. "They just have a different style," she said, sipping her drink, "a different way of showing love." That word love felt so misshapen in her mouth. I didn't answer her right away. I needed time to locate myself in the room again, to breathe through the anger that had started to collect just behind my ribs. You know, I finally said your mother used to bring me wildflowers in fistfuls, back when we didn't have a garden. I'd put them in whatever glass I could find, and we'd name each one, even the weeds. We said the weeds were just misunderstood. She tilted her head. That's cute. I swallowed the sigh that rose in my throat. It wasn't meant to be cute, I said softly. It was meant to teach her not to throw things away just because they didn't match the wallpaper. She blinked. Her smile dimmed just slightly. I saw something flicker in her, then maybe recognition, maybe just discomfort. She looked at the table instead of me. There was no apology, no shame. Just a quiet deflection the way people do when they don't want to touch the truth too directly, like it might stain them. After she left, I found myself sitting on the back steps alone, the cool wood pressing through my skirt. I looked out over the yard where she used to play, now trimmed and bare the way my daughter preferred it. No more wildflowers, just manicured grass and stones that led nowhere in particular. I couldn't stop thinking about that smile. It wasn't just that it didn't belong, it wasn't real. Not here, not with me. It was rehearsed somewhere else, in her world of perfect lighting and pre-approved feelings. In her world, everything had to make sense, look clean, feel digestible. But life, real life, isn't like that. It's messy. It's contradictory. It loves fiercely and stumbles loudly, and it doesn't always match the vibe. I thought about how easily she had dismissed the discomfort in the room, how natural it seemed to her to smooth things over rather than confront what was wrong. She hadn't said anything cruel. That was the thing. None of them had. Their sharpness came wrapped in velvet dipped in sugar. They didn't stab. They erased. I stayed outside until the moon rose, until the quiet became a companion instead of a burden. I needed that time, to hear myself think, to remember who I was beneath all their softness and scorn. Inside the wicker chair sat empty. Her scent had faded. And I knew then more clearly than I ever had that the house was no longer mine. Not really. Not in the way it used to be. Not in the way that mattered. The walls still stood, but the soul had been slowly pushed into the corners, told it was too loud, too much, too colorful. And I was tired of apologizing for taking up space in a life I built. That night, after the house had emptied and the silence settled in like dust, I sat at the table alone. The plates were stacked neatly by the sink. The cake, half eaten and flavorless, stood slumped in its box like it had given up trying to be celebrated. No balloons this year. I hadn't wanted them. At 75, you stop wanting things that float only to deflate by morning. The kitchen smelled of lemon soap and something faintly bitter, maybe resentment, maybe the roasted vegetables that had cooled untouched. I stared at the empty chair across from me, the one where my nurse had sat and wondered if she felt the way I did, tolerated, then removed. She hadn't said a word about their treatment of her, not even in goodbye. But kindness has a way of absorbing cruelty in silence, and that silence is sometimes the loudest thing in the room. Earlier that day, I'd worn a soft lilac dress, the same one I wore on my 60th when my husband was still alive, when the backyard had been strung with lights and laughter flowed like wine. I remember the way he danced with our granddaughter that night, spinning her across the grass in her bare feet. That little girl used to squeal when she saw me. Now she squinted at me like I was something to interpret, something remote. There was a time when birthdays felt like a celebration. Now they felt like performance reviews. They showed up, checked boxes, took a photo or two, and left before the candles melted. I had tried to slow it down, to tell a story or offer a memory, but they had somewhere to be. They always did. I cut myself a thin slice of the cake, sat down with a fork and let it rest on my tongue without chewing. It tasted like money expensive but unsatisfying. It didn't melt. It just waited to be swallowed. I thought of my daughter's comment. "You really need to be more selective, Mom." As if my choices were embarrassing. As if my friends were accessories she hadn't approved of. There was a time when she would have curled into my side on the sofa and asked me to braid her hair, begging for one more story before bed. She used to believe I had magic. Now she thought I had poor taste. I'd spent a lifetime shaping that house into a home. Every window treatment, every framed photograph, every creaky stair held a memory. But suddenly, it was as if all of it was under review, as if I'd been deemed off-brand. Their world was one of curated perfection, gray tones matching cutlery birthday parties that looked good in square photos. They didn't want love. They wanted aesthetic. And in their eyes, my affection, my raw, wild, unfiltered affection, was clutter. So they rearranged the table, not literally, of course, but spiritually. They sat closest to each other, formed a small unit within the group, left my friend to the edge, left me somewhere in the middle, close enough to placate, far enough to avoid. That evening, after the dishwasher hummed its sterile lullaby, I opened the window and let in the night air. It was cool and smelled faintly of grass and old jasmine. My husband had planted that jasmine. Every year it came back, even after he didn't. I leaned on the windowsill and looked out at the dark lawn. I could almost see him there, standing under the porch light, holding 2 glasses of iced tea, calling my name. The man who told me once, "This house isn't just walls, it's your laughter echoing through them." But I hadn't laughed today. Not really. I closed the window and stood in the kitchen for a long time, hands gripping the edge of the counter. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was something older, deeper than anger. It was grief. The kind that seeps in quietly when you realize the people you love don't see you anymore. Or worse, see you and wish you were someone else. That's what had happened today. A quiet betrayal. A decision made not in one blow, but over 1,000 small rejections. A gesture, a glance, a silence too long. I was no longer central. I was decor, optional. And yet they had still come, still smiled for pictures, still passed the breadbasket like we were one big happy family. But families aren't supposed to curate love. They're supposed to cradle it even when it shows up with chipped polish and yellow blouses. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat in the living room under the soft glow of the lamp. The chair across from me still carried her impression. And I knew then, in a way, that settled into my bones, I wasn't angry they had judged her. I was angry they made me complicit in it. That night, long after the tea had gone cold beside me and the quiet had hardened into something nearly brittle, I found myself walking toward the guest bedroom downstairs, the one across the hall from the laundry room with the floral curtains and the quilt I made when my hands were still quick. It had always been a place of comfort, never a spare room, but a refuge, a space for whoever needed it. That was how I'd always seen this house. Not a statement, not a legacy, but a shelter. The door creaked as I pushed it open. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I knew this room like I knew my own skin. I could navigate it by touch, by memory. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs sighing beneath my weight. The mattress still held the shape of the last person who'd slept there. My nurse. A few weeks back, she had stayed the night after I'd had a particularly dizzy spell. She insisted even though I told her I'd be fine. She made me toast, drew a bath, and then sat here in this room reading under the glow of a dusty old lamp while I slept down the hall. I could still smell her perfume faintly on the pillowcase, her quiet scent of earth and spice, something clean and human. I ran my fingers across the edge of the nightstand, stopping at the little glass dish where guests left their earrings or hair ties, and I remembered how she had once left a note there. Just 4 words scribbled on a sticky pad. "Thank you for safety." I had never told anyone about that note. I'd folded it into my drawer like a secret blessing. This room wasn't empty, not to me. It was heavy with presence, with care, and yet after what happened today, it felt different. Or maybe it just reflected back the truth I hadn't wanted to see. The people who called themselves family hadn't come into this room in years. They didn't know it still had a copy of Little Women on the shelf, the one I used to read to my daughter when she was sick. They didn't remember that it was here on this very bed that she once cried after her first heartbreak, sobbing into my lap while I ran my fingers through her hair. Now she walked past this door without a glance. Now she referred to my guest as that woman. Now my home was theirs to critique, and my compassion something to be filtered for better lighting. I sat there still and small and asked myself something I had been avoiding for a while. How long had I been making myself smaller to keep their image clean? How many times had I swallowed discomfort, dulled my edges, softened my voice all so they wouldn't feel the weight of my disapproval? They had made me feel like a burden in my own house, like my friends, my style, even my voice was a distortion of what they wanted to project. They wanted neutral walls, quiet guests, predictable stories. And here I was, too sentimental, too open, too much. I closed my eyes and imagined this room in their hands, repainted, stripped of books, the quilt removed, replaced by sterile throws, her note discarded, a life erased by interior design, a history replaced by clean lines and catalog furniture. It wasn't just a bedroom. It was memory. It was evidence of who I had been, of the kind of love that doesn't ask to be Instagram worthy, the kind of love that stays up through the night just to make sure you're still breathing. I stood up slowly, my knees complaining as they always do, and made my way back into the hallway. I passed the mirror hanging near the coat closet and caught my reflection just briefly. I looked older than I remembered, not because of the wrinkles or the white in my hair, but because I looked tired, not physically, soul tired. I whispered aloud, "What am I holding on to exactly?" And I didn't have an answer. This house, my house, had once been full of chaos and laughter and mess, toys, scattered music, too loud late-night phone calls, and mismatched furniture. It had been alive, and somewhere along the way I had let it be turned into a museum for a family that no longer saw its value beyond its resale potential. I was still here, still breathing, still full of love and stories and years of knowing what mattered. But they didn't ask. They didn't see. And I wasn't going to wait for them to catch up. The following morning, the sun poured through the lace curtains with that kind of innocent light that makes everything feel momentarily new. But nothing had changed. Not really. The napkins were still folded in the trash, crusted with dried egg and judgment. The cake box still sat slightly open on the counter, like even it had lost the will to pretend. I walked into the kitchen barefoot, the tile cool against my skin, and started putting away the silverware from the dishwasher. Each fork clinked with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. It was strange how even the simplest acts can feel like defiance when your world has been quietly disrespected. I moved slowly, deliberately, placing every utensil into its proper place, one by one, like I was restoring order to a kingdom no one else believed in anymore. That's when it hit me. I wasn't angry about one brunch. I wasn't even angry about one conversation behind a door. I was angry about years, about all the slow, quiet humiliations I had endured to keep the peace. about all the times I had bit my tongue until it bled just to avoid being labeled difficult, about how many of my own preferences I had edited out of my life so they wouldn't roll their eyes. Do you know what it's like to host a holiday where everyone criticizes your food, then takes home leftovers? What it's like to watch them rearrange your home while calling it an upgrade? To be a ghost in your own kitchen, while they complain that your curtains are too floral and your sofa too soft. It's not one moment, it's hundreds, thousands, a storm that builds over years disguised as tradition. And somehow yesterday's whispers, those careless little knives, had sliced through all of it at once. I finished with the silverware, wiped the counters, and stood staring at the window above the sink. The garden was there as it always had been. But even that felt altered. The jasmine was blooming, yes, but now I saw the way the hedges had been trimmed without my consent last year, when my daughter sent a landscaper as a surprise. I hadn't wanted it cleaned up. I liked the wildness, the tangled roots and unpredictable color. But they said it looked uncontrolled, and so it was tamed. Like me. I walked through each room that morning with new eyes. The hallway, once lined with candid photos, now bore only 2 black and white, tastefully framed, selected by my daughter during her redecorating phase. The rest were boxed away in the closet. Faces I had loved. Moments that mattered. Replaced with minimalist nothing. I paused in the living room and stared at the fireplace mantel. There used to be a little ceramic bird that sat there, cheap, silly something my granddaughter had painted in kindergarten. It had gone missing 2 Christmases ago. When I asked about it, they laughed. Oh, that thing, it didn't really match the rest of the decor. I had smiled. I always smiled. But now the weight of all those little decisions pressed on my chest like a stone. I realized I had been exiled from my own life in increments, with every rug replaced, every wall repainted, every keepsake tucked away under the guise of tidiness. And I had let them, because I was trying to be generous, because I thought accommodating them meant they'd see me, love me, stay. But all it had done was teach them that I could be redesigned, that I didn't need space, I was space, an empty vessel to fill with whatever made them comfortable. My nurse had never once moved anything in my house. She never adjusted the lighting, never offered unsolicited advice about the furniture, never flinched at the clutter of old stories piled high on side tables. She treated my home like it had breath. And my family, they treated it like it had resale value. I opened the pantry and stared at the shelves. So many things I had bought to please them. Almond flour for my granddaughter's gluten-free trend. Coconut sugar for my daughter's cleanse. Snack bars I couldn't pronounce. Things I didn't eat. Things I didn't like. I had given them the pantry, the living room, the guest list, the tone of my voice. I had offered it all like a dish passed across the table. And now even my grief was expected to be tidy. But no more. I didn't slam anything. I didn't break plates or scream into the floor. That's not how my rage moved. Mine was quieter, like wind under a door, like silverware being returned to its proper place with just a bit too much precision. I wiped down the table, cleared the napkins, took out the trash. Then I sat down in the wicker chair by the window, the one they had mocked with their glances and side comments, and I let myself feel, not just anger, but sorrow, deep, old sorrow, the kind that had lived in my chest for years, sleeping under the surface like a coiled thing. And I realized with sudden crystalline clarity, if I didn't act now, they would repurpose everything, not just my house, but me. That evening, the light left slowly, dragging its long golden fingers across the walls, as if reluctant to let go. The house grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe but listens, and I swear even the floorboards felt different under my feet, heavier, wiser, like they had absorbed everything and were waiting to see what I would do next. I wandered the hallway in my slippers' arms wrapped loosely around my waist, like I was trying to hold myself together. Each step brought a creak, a whisper of memory. Here, this spot where my daughter once fell and scraped her knee. There, the edge of the baseboard where I marked my granddaughter's height each birthday, until she was too old for that. The marks were still faintly there, though they had tried to paint over them once. I paused near the hall closet, opened the door out of habit. The scent inside was familiar old coats, lavender sachets, time. I ran my fingers across the sleeves, the forgotten scarves, and touched a shoebox tucked into the back. Inside were birthday cards, some yellowed, some still crisp. One from my husband the year before he died. It read, "You're still the pulse of this home." I sat down on the hallway bench and held the card in my lap. My fingers trembled, but not from weakness. No, this was something else. Something like power returning after years of absence, like a river rising after a long drought. That hallway had been my life's artery. How many nights had I stood there, pressing my ear to bedroom doors to make sure my daughter was still breathing after a fever? How many times had I waited there for footsteps, for news, for love to return? And now it was a corridor of quiet betrayals. Every family picture that had once hung there had been replaced with abstract prints. Modern touches, my daughter called them. But what she really meant was erasure. Clean walls for a sanitized story. I stood and walked to the end of the hallway where the window overlooked the street. The neighbor's porch light flickered on. A moth circled it blindly over and over. I watched it, and I thought, how many years have I been that moth, spiraling around a glow that wasn't made for me? I thought back to the nurse again, how she had never once asked me to change anything. She didn't try to improve my life. She simply entered it, as it was, with open hands and steady eyes. There was a time when that hallway held giggles and running feet, late-night snacks, and whispered goodbyes. Now it held silence, polished silence, and me. I returned to my bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the wardrobe across from me. Inside were all the clothes I kept for them, the ones they liked to see me in. Neutral tones, nothing too loud. Gone were my patterned scarves, my brighter shawls. I had folded away parts of myself so they wouldn't look at me the way they looked at my friend. I opened a drawer and pulled out one of the scarves, a deep plum one with a paisley print that made me feel like my mother, bold, unapologetic romantic, in a way that didn't need permission. I wrapped it around my shoulders and sat very still. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't rebellion. This was remembrance of who I had been before their rules, their filters, their slow erasures. In the hallway, the old grandfather clock ticked with a deliberate rhythm, each sound like a heartbeat in the dark. I looked around the room, then down at my hands, veined, soft-lined with time, and I remembered everything they had held. Babies, books, bones, bread dough, loss. These hands had earned their place in every room of this house. I rose and walked back through the hallway again, this time slower, more deliberate. My fingertips grazed the walls, not just to steady myself, but to reclaim. This was my home. My stories were soaked into these walls, and no minimalist print could cover that. I stopped outside the guest room door. I didn't open it this time. I just stood there, one hand on the knob, one hand on my scarf. It wasn't rage I felt. It was resolve, quiet and warm and unshakable. They wanted a version of me that matched their table settings. But I had been setting tables since before they knew how to chew. And I had just decided I was done making myself small. The next morning, I didn't rise early out of habit. I rose because I was done sleeping through my own life. The tea kettle hissed a bit louder. The floor creaked with more presence under my heels, and I found myself standing in the kitchen awake, in a way I hadn't been in years. My breath felt round in my chest, heavier, yes, but fuller, more mine. I poured a cup of tea and sat in the wicker chair by the window, still wearing the plum scarf. The sunlight spilled across my lap like a warm hand. I could hear the birds in the hedges, indifferent to the drama of human beings. And for a long moment, I didn't think about anyone else. Not them, not the brunch, not the wound that had been whispering beneath my ribs. I thought only of this house, what it had meant, what it had been reduced to, and what it could be if I let it go. The idea didn't come like thunder. It wasn't dramatic. It came softly like most truths do. I took a sip of my tea, looked out the window at the porch where my granddaughter once played with chalk, and I simply whispered to myself, I'm done. Not with them, with the waiting, with the hoping, with the shrinking, with pretending I was lucky to still be allowed to live here on their terms. I stood, walked to the phone, yes, the landline, and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. The realtor who had helped us buy this house after we first got married. I remembered her because she didn't try to sell us something shiny. She listened. She looked at the way I smiled at certain windows, the way I walked slower down certain hallways. She helped us find a place with soul, not status. Her voice crackled through the receiver, aged like mine. I'm thinking about selling, I said. A pause. Then is everything all right? And for the first time in what felt like decades, I answered without hesitation. It will be. She said she'd come by the next day. I hung up and stared at the phone, half expecting to feel regret or guilt or fear. But instead, I felt air, a breath I hadn't taken in years. That afternoon, my daughter called. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before I picked up. I already knew why she was calling. She'd probably heard from my granddaughter that things had felt off during the brunch. Maybe she wanted to smooth it over. Maybe she was going to remind me how sensitive I can be. But none of it mattered now. Hi, Mom, she said, her voice all false light. Hello. There was a pause. I could almost hear her arranging her next sentence like furniture, neatly, tastefully, with no clutter. I just wanted to check in. I hope yesterday wasn't too overwhelming. You know how some people can be off-putting. And there it was, a neat erasure, dismissal, dressed up as concern. Do you mean my friend? I asked. Another pause, longer this time. I just think there's a certain atmosphere that's best for these kinds of events, and— You mean your kind of atmosphere, I interrupted calmly, not mine. She sighed. Mom, don't do this. I'm not doing anything, I said, soft but firm. I'm just realizing I don't want to host people who critique kindness as if it's decor. That's not what happened. It is, I said. You just didn't say it with enough cruelty for it to be called by name. She went quiet then. I let the silence sit between us. Heavy, true. I'll be putting the house on the market, I said. I just thought you should hear it from me. What? I've already called someone. She's coming tomorrow. Mom, be serious. This is your home. No, I said. It was. And now it's a showroom for people who think love has to match their couch. Her voice rose, then startled. So you're just going to give it up for her? And I didn't flinch. No, for me. She didn't answer. The silence now wasn't space, it was retreat. Disbelief. Fear that the foundation had shifted in a way she hadn't approved. I think I said softly that you all need a place to gather that fits your vibe, but I don't need to be the one to provide it. Mom, come on, where would you even go? I smiled to myself. Somewhere I can laugh out loud and wear color and invite people who still see me. Somewhere I can breathe. She started to speak again, but I had already said everything I needed to. I told her I had to go, and I meant it. I placed the phone gently back on the cradle. The sound it made was final, not harsh, but full of closure. Outside, the light had shifted. The day was already waning. But inside me, something had just begun. By the time the realtor came the next morning, I had already packed 2 boxes. Not everything, just the first things that mattered. My mother's locket, a worn recipe card for cinnamon bread, stained in the corner from decades of flour-dusted fingers. The sticky note from my nurse folded gently into a jewelry box that hadn't held jewelry in years. These were not things you list in a real estate inventory. These were the reasons the house had ever mattered at all. She arrived on time, older now like me, with the same silver streak in her hair and the same way of tilting her head when she listened. She didn't ask why I was selling. She just looked around the house, let her hands linger on the wood banister, and said, "This place still has a heartbeat." I smiled. "That's the problem," I said. "No one else hears it." She walked through the rooms without judgment, didn't flinch at the clutter, didn't criticize the wallpaper. She simply took notes, and at one point, she turned back to me and said, "You could ask a good price for this, location alone." I nodded. "I don't want top dollar," I said. "I want the right person." She understood. While she measured and jotted things down, I returned to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Inside were quilts, letters, a strand of pearls that had belonged to my grandmother. I started sorting, not as an act of sadness, but of ceremony. Every item I touched, I asked myself, does this feel like me, or like the version of me they wanted me to become? The pile of discards grew quickly. Linen napkins bought for one of my daughter's Pinterest-inspired brunches, a pale throw blanket that looked like it belonged in a spa, not a life. An entire drawer of candles I never lit because their smell gave me a headache, but she insisted they looked elegant. Downstairs, my phone buzzed. A message from my granddaughter. Just a heart emoji. No words. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because I was done with half gestures. I needed full sentences now, honest ones. By noon, I'd packed 4 more boxes. I labeled them in my own handwriting. Not just kitchen or bathroom, but my Sunday morning's things I touched when I missed him what they never asked about. And while I packed, I could almost hear them somewhere across town, my daughter and her husband, talking over coffee, planning their next visit. Perhaps assuming I'd cool down, that I'd return to form, that I'd apologize for being too sensitive, as I had so many times before. I imagined them sitting at their long dining table, white walls behind them, a curated orchid blooming politely in the corner, her voice even measured. "She just needs time," his voice firm. "She won't go through with it. The house is all she has." That's what they thought. But they were wrong. This house had been a vessel, but I was the sea. That afternoon, I pulled down the box of old records from the hall closet, dusty but intact, my husband's favorites, mine too. I played one soft, jazzy, the kind of music that knows how to stretch out a moment. And for the first time in years, I danced. Just a few slow steps across the living room, alone in socks like I used to, before the house became a gallery. I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, scarf still wrapped around my shoulders, cheeks a little flushed, and for a moment, I looked exactly like myself. They would say I was emotional, that I was being reckless, that this was some reaction to a brunch gone poorly. But no, this was the opposite of reaction. This was restoration. I was taking back the sound of my own footsteps in this space, reclaiming the air I used to fill without apology, and as I wrapped up another box and wrote, "Front room keep," across the top, I smiled. Let them plan their futures inside a house they thought they could inherit like a spreadsheet. I had other plans. Plans that didn't include white furniture and silent judgment. Plans that didn't require permission. And every item I packed was another word in a language they'd never learned. Boundaries. Memory. Self-respect. Freedom. I didn't tell them, not because I was being petty, not because I wanted to hurt them. I didn't tell them because I didn't owe them the performance of my leaving, not after years of being edited, rephrased, dressed up in manners for their comfort. There comes a point when even goodbyes become too expensive to give. So I let the silence do the talking. The for sale sign arrived 2 days later. A thin man in a ball cap pounded it into the earth by the hedge as the jasmine clung on blooming against time. He nodded at me politely, then returned to his van. I watched from the porch with my coffee in hand, the same way I had watched squirrels scamper along that fence for years, the same way I'd watched birthday parties unfold in the yard, arguments disappear into the garage, love stretch and shrink like laundry on the line. And now it was all up for grabs. I hadn't said a word to my daughter since the call. I knew she'd find out eventually. Word travels. Whether it came from the neighbor's raised eyebrow or a passing remark at the grocery store, it didn't matter. The truth was in the yard, in the grass they once called too long, in the sign they could not unsee. I kept packing box by box. The items I left behind weren't worthless, they just weren't mine anymore. They were ghosts of compromise, little pieces of surrender I didn't recognize until I touched them again. There was the butter dish she bought me for photos, she said, after insisting mine looked too grandma. It went in the donation pile. The modern lamp that threw light like a dentist's office, gone. The elegant placemats that matched nothing I owned, gone. I wanted warmth, story, texture, things with fingerprints and laugh lines. My nurse came by that evening to drop off some books. When she saw the boxes, she paused, worry blooming gently in her expression. "You sure?" she asked. "I'm finally sure," I said. She smiled then, not the polite kind, the kind that shows up when someone recognizes your courage because they've had to find theirs too. We sat in the living room, the light dimming around us. I offered her tea. She declined, then changed her mind. "Actually, yes, if you're making it." While the water boiled, we didn't speak. It wasn't awkward. It was the silence of people who trust each other enough to breathe without filling every space. I carried the tray into the room and set it on the coffee table that had held everything from soup to secrets over the years. "Where will you go?" she asked gently. "I don't know yet, but wherever it is, I'll bring myself with me this time." She reached across the table and touched my hand just briefly, but it was enough. I didn't need applause, just witness. That night I walked room to room one last time, though I hadn't sold it yet, and the contract wasn't signed. But something in me had already moved. My soul had let go before the papers could catch up. I paused in the doorway of each space, whispered a quiet thank you. To the hallway that taught me the sound of growing up. To the pantry that held so many worried dinners and hopeful pies. To the garden where so much laughter once tumbled through the grass. I stood in the foyer where so many greetings and goodbyes had happened, where my daughter once ran in from the rain soaking wet, holding her shoes in her hands like trophies, where my granddaughter, just 3 at the time, gave me a drawing of me, you, and pancakes. I let it all come back. Then I let it all go. I didn't tell them, because sometimes telling people is another form of asking them to see you. And I was done asking. I wasn't leaving in anger. I was leaving in wholeness. And the funny thing is, leaving quietly often echoes louder than any door slammed shut. The next morning, the calls started. I knew they would. It wasn't the sign in the yard that did it. It was the silence. When a woman who's always made room at the table suddenly stops setting places people notice. My daughter's name lit up on the phone first, Then again, I let it ring. No part of me itched to answer. The message she left was clipped, but dressed in false sweetness. Saw the sign. Call me, please. I'm confused. Confused. As if I hadn't spent years offering explanations, as if my needs had never been translated clearly in 100 quiet ways. No, she wasn't confused. She was alarmed, because the script had changed, and for once I hadn't given her a copy. The next message wasn't as polite. This is overreacting, Mom. We should have talked about this as a family. You don't just sell the house without telling us. But I wasn't theirs to be consulted. I wasn't a mat they could wipe their designer shoes on while I served them brunch with a brittle smile. I had been a hostess to my own erasure for too long. That afternoon, she came by unannounced. I heard the car pull up before the knock. I didn't rush to the door. I didn't even pretend to be surprised. When I opened it, she stood there in her beige blazer and her polished expression, the one that always seemed to belong more to the women she worked with than to the girl I raised. "We need to talk," she said. I know I said calmly, but not here, not today. Her eyes widened. "Mom, what is happening?" I stepped onto the porch. I didn't invite her in. She looked past me as if trying to peek into a place she no longer owned, like a stranger trying to remember the layout of a home she once visited as a child. I saw the sign, she said again, as if it would undo something. "I put it there," I said, my voice quiet, and I meant it. "This is about her, isn't it?" Her tone sharpened. I didn't flinch. "No, this is about me." She crossed her arms. "You're being dramatic." I laughed softly, not a cruel laugh, but the kind that escapes when someone finally hears themselves. "You always say that when I do something you can't control." She started pacing her heels, tapping on the porch boards. "You're throwing away everything we built, everything we planned for, the holidays, the family gatherings." I looked at her, really looked, and I said, "You stopped planning holidays with me a long time ago. You planned them around me. There's a difference." She shook her head. "We wanted you comfortable. We just wanted everything to look nice." "And what about how it felt?" I asked. Silence. "Do you even remember the last time you asked me what I wanted?" I continued. "Not what matched the plates, not what would look good in a photo. What I wanted." She opened her mouth, closed it again. I stepped back toward the door. "You can visit," I said. "Wherever I go next, you can visit, but not like this, not with judgment in your eyes and edits in your voice." She didn't move, just stood there like a woman trying to recognize a painting she once helped hang, now suddenly realizing it had more color than she remembered. I gave a small nod. I've rescinded the invitation to the version of brunch where I'm served last and thanked least. I won't be hosting that anymore. She swallowed hard, then whispered, "This isn't fair." "No," I said gently, "it's not, but it's free." I walked back inside and closed the door, not hard, not to hurt her, but to hold myself. I stood in the foyer, hand resting on the doorknob, heart steady. No tears, just breath. That evening I set the table again, just for two. The nurse was coming by with soup and a new book she thought I'd like. I used the violet-rimmed china. No matching napkins, no centerpiece, just warmth. And this time no one muttered about anyone not fitting in. Because finally I had made space for something real. The house went on the market quietly, like the first cold breeze that whispers that summer is over. No grand announcement, no open house with champagne and brochures, just a simple listing a sign in the yard, and one truth woven into every word of the description, a home filled with memory and light. The calls started rolling and some curious others cold. Investors. couples with checklists, young professionals wanting to gut it and start over. The realtor filtered them, kindly understanding I wasn't just selling wood and nails. I was setting something down that had carried my name in every nail hole and paint smudge. I told her I'd wait. I'd know the right person when they walked in. I wasn't selling a structure. I was passing forward a sanctuary. The day she arrived, I was in the kitchen arranging a small tray of lemon cookies and 2 cups of tea, an old habit from when I used to teach Sunday school, and every visitor deserved a welcome. She came in slowly without heels, without an air of conquest. Just jeans, a weathered notebook, and eyes that didn't scan for renovation ideas. She looked up first. At the ceiling, the corners, the light that poured through the eastern windows like it was something sacred. I watched from the threshold as she touched the banister, gently smiled at the creaky floorboard near the hallway, and lingered in the guest room longer than anyone else had. When she returned to the kitchen, she looked at me and said, "It feels like someone's loved this place without trying to perfect it." I didn't smile. I breathed. And in that moment I knew. She didn't ask how old the appliances were. She didn't inquire about square footage or upgrade timelines. She asked if the jasmine out front bloomed every spring. I told her yes, even when no one remembers to water it. She nodded, eyes soft. That's a good sign. We sat at the table, sipped tea. She told me about her own mother, long gone, and how she'd been looking for a place where she could feel her presence again, not in the photos or furniture, but in the corners, in the warmth. I asked what she did for work. She said she was a hospice counselor, that she helped people let go with grace. I felt my throat catch then, but I didn't cry. I just reached for another cookie and said, "That must teach you a lot about what matters." She nodded. Mostly that love leaves an imprint, if you know how to look. She didn't haggle, didn't offer under asking. She said I'd be honored to live here. The next morning the papers were ready. I signed them without fanfare, not because it wasn't a big deal, but because I had already done the letting go in my spirit days ago. The contract was just the echo. When my daughter found out she didn't call this time, she texted, "So it's final then." I responded with a single line, "Yes, I chose someone who saw the soul of the place." She never replied. That afternoon, I walked the woman through the rooms again, not as seller and buyer, but as one caretaker handing the key to another. I showed her the mark on the baseboard where my granddaughter's height was scratched in pencil. She smiled and said she wouldn't paint over it. In the hallway, I gave her a tiny envelope. Inside was the sticky note from my nurse. "Thank you for safety." I said, "You don't have to keep it, but you should know it was written here." She folded it gently, placed it in her coat pocket, and whispered, "I'll keep it." I handed her the keys. No ceremony, no fuss, just a press of metal to palm. "Take care of her," I said, meaning the house, meaning myself. She nodded. "I will." And just like that, I left. No final tour, no long romantic glances. I stepped outside into the crisp wind and walked to the car that waited with its trunk full of my real treasures. Not things, choices. I didn't look back, not because I wasn't sentimental, but because I finally had somewhere else to go. I didn't move into anything grand, no beachfront villa or sleek city apartment, just a little house tucked on the edge of a quiet street, shaded by a pair of gnarled trees that leaned like old friends into each other. The porch had chipped paint, the windows groaned when the wind touched them, and the garden out back was more wild than kept. In other words, it was perfect. It was mine. I moved in with only what I loved, no more than what could fit in the back seat and trunk. A few boxes of books, the paisley scarf, the violet china plates, my husband's record player. The nurse helped me settle in. She came by with a casserole wrapped in a kitchen towel that smelled like rosemary and thyme, and we unpacked in laughter instead of panic. There was no speech made, no toast raised. We just made tea and sat on the floor of my new living room, surrounded by half-open boxes and the soft thump of Ella Fitzgerald drifting from the corner. The room didn't have the polished sheen of the house I left behind, but it had something better welcome. There were no curated photo walls, no shelves arranged by color, just a lamp I liked, and a chair that cradled my spine the way old friends do. In the weeks that followed, I didn't host brunches, I didn't decorate seasonally, I didn't polish myself into something I wasn't. Instead, I wrote letters. I baked small things. I read books aloud to no one in particular. I took up embroidery again, stitched little flowers into napkins I would never use for show. Some days I wore my colorful shawls for no reason, but to feel like myself. I played records while watering the plants, and the house slowly learned the rhythm of my footsteps. There were no expectations here. No one asking why I didn't hang curtains yet or repaint the door. I could leave dishes in the sink. I could leave silence in the room. And in that stillness, I heard myself again. I realized something I hadn't fully understood until now. The house I left behind had become a mirror, one that only reflected me if I stood just right. But this place, this quiet little pocket of breath and space, it didn't require poses. It saw me from all angles, and it never asked me to apologize. One afternoon, the nurse brought over a small potted plant, something green and tangled, not quite pretty in a traditional way, but alive in a way that insisted on being noticed. "It reminded me of you," she said with a smile. I placed it on the windowsill. It looked like it had always belonged there. We didn't talk much that day. We didn't need to. She sat in the chair near the window, the wicker one I had brought with me, the same chair they once rolled their eyes at, and when she leaned into it, when she settled into its soft creaks and familiar embrace, I felt something click inside me. I hadn't just brought the past into this new place. I had brought the essence of who I was before I tried to be someone for them. This house held no ghosts, only memory. And the memory wasn't heavy, it was whole. I still got texts from my daughter, neutral ones. "Hope you're well." Sent a picture of the baby. "Let us know if you need anything." I responded when I felt like it, which wasn't often, not out of spite, but because my time was now currency and I was finally spending it where it counted. And maybe, just maybe, I had finally learned that love doesn't need to match the drapes or wear beige. Sometimes it wears sunflowers and smells like eucalyptus. Sometimes it shows up with soup. Sometimes it sits beside you and says nothing, but stays anyway. The last time I drove by the old house, it wasn't planned. I had taken a different route home from the market, one that wound past familiar streets I once knew like the lines of my own palm. It was a clear afternoon, the kind that makes shadows seem softer, and without realizing it, I slowed the car as I neared the place I had once poured my entire life into. The new owner had already moved in. I could tell by the wind chime that danced by the porch rail, the kind made of driftwood and old keys. There was a blue throw draped over the banister, and a small hand-painted sign beside the jasmine that read, "Let things grow." I didn't stop. I didn't need to. Just seeing the house alive in a new way was enough. It didn't ache. It didn't sting. It felt like watching a bird finally lift off from your hands after being cradled too long. You hope it finds something better than what you gave it, but you also know what you gave was real. They still talk about it, I'm sure, my daughter, her husband. They probably call it impulsive. They probably tell the story with narrowed eyes and exaggerated sighs, casting me as the woman who gave away the family home for nothing. But I gave it to someone who saw it, who saw me. And that was everything. I've learned in this quieter chapter of life that not all inheritances are meant to be passed down. Some must be let go, not out of bitterness, but clarity. Because when you realize your legacy is being rebranded as inconvenience, it is no longer your legacy, it's their project. I think that's what they never understood. This wasn't just about real estate, this was about dignity, about identity, about a woman reclaiming the walls she once built with her hands and heart. I no longer wake up to footsteps I recognize. I no longer host birthdays or make casseroles for people who inspect my ingredients. But I do wake up to birdsong. I water my plants. I play my records. I laugh often to myself, and sometimes out loud when the kettle whistles just as I finish a sentence in the book I'm reading. The nurse still visits. Sometimes she brings pastries, other times just herself. We talk about the past less now. We talk about next spring's garden. We talk about ideas, about being women who refuse to be trimmed to fit someone else's border. And in that little kitchen with its mismatched tiles and open shelves, I found something rare, a kind of peace that doesn't apologize for existing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't send dramatic letters. I didn't host one final confrontation. I just remembered my worth. And the moment I did the house, the one they tried to shape into a showroom, was no longer mine, because it never really was, not in the way it used to be. A home should echo your laugh, not stifle it. It should cradle your memories, not sand them down to fit a trend. I gave them silence, and in it I found peace. Now the days stretch, softer. Time moves like a slow river, steady and unbothered, and I no longer chase after anything that does not belong to me. There's freedom in knowing you don't need to convince anyone of your value. Freedom in closing a door without slamming it, without notes left behind, or keys mailed back. In this quiet, I've discovered the weightlessness of being unseen by those who never truly looked. I sit most mornings by a different window now with light that doesn't ask me to dim. I wear what I want. I say what I mean. I drink my tea before it cools because I'm no longer waiting for anyone to join me before I begin. Some endings don't arrive with thunder. They come with stillness, with one deep breath, one firm decision. And then the world rearranges itself to fit the shape of your courage. To anyone who feels the walls of their own life growing unfamiliar, let me say this. You are allowed to walk out without explanation. You're allowed to stop folding yourself into someone else's design. You're allowed to begin again. The house was never the home. You are the home. And you still have so many rooms left to unlock.